So, really wonderful to be on a Zoom call with Bradford Werner, who's the amazing classical guitarist behind This Is Classical Guitar, the YouTube channel, which is just an incredible resource. So many people that I come across at Conservatoire and all my students, they all know about your channel, Brad. It's fantastic. And, of course, your extensive catalogue of editions, music editions for classical guitar, which is great because they're all progressive. So it's just wonderful to be talking to you. Fantastic.
Thanks so much for having me, and I'm very excited about chatting as well. I just have so many questions, and I'm so excited to discuss this stuff because it's a personal interest of mine, and this was a really fun project. So I'm really happy to be chatting.
It's absolutely brilliant, and also for me, it's really nice to sort of be reaching out, crossing over to classical guitarists because we have this sort of mutual respect for the repertoire, and it's a shame there's not more crossover because sometimes I feel we're going along sort of parallel tracks, and just to share the repertoire, and we both have a fondness for this early Italian repertoire. And we've chosen a piece. I threw this piece at you from the Siena Lute book. And we had two sources, didn't we? One of the Siena Lute book, and the other one was this Paris manuscript, which is slightly earlier. So you chose which one of those to base your score on?
So since we had like a really clear access to the manuscript for the Siena book, I definitely chose
Yeah.
I chose that one. It's nice and clean as well, which is nice. And yeah, but there is a different version, and I've put some performance notes. There's not too many changes, but especially those last two measures are quite different. But I've chosen the Siena.
Yes, yeah. Well, I did for the same reason because the Paris one's virtually, it's illegible. But just to explain to the listeners that the Siena Lute book has got a lot of mystique about it. We don't know who the author was. We don't know who owned it or who wrote out the music. But in it, it's like one of the most comprehensive sources for 16th century Italian lute repertoire. It's got about 170 pieces in. But it's a little bit frustrating because there are a lot of pieces, beautiful pieces in this book that are unattributed. And the piece that we're going to share and talk about today, Recercata Bella, is one of those.
It's such a great opportunity for guitar players too to have a guitar version and everything like that, but then
Yeah.
to simultaneously have the lute version too is going to be so wonderful. And to hear a little bit of advice from both, I think it's
Yeah.
just fantastic, and it should happen, yeah, way more often.
Yes, yeah.
All the master classes I've played in for lute players, I found it so rewarding. So I think
Yeah.
it should be definitely done more often.
So, what are your thoughts on that opening? Because it's got this amazing kind of like fantasy sort of linear lines, this kind of. It's just this sort of simple scale, isn't it? It's just really sort of fantastical.
Yeah, I quite like that though. It's you see it in some of the lute tutor books, like like sometimes they'll open like have students play some scale work and stuff like that,
Yeah,
and
sure.
some of the earlier like preludes and things like that have similar passages like that.
Yeah, yeah.
I it was a it's like almost it's also quite nice because before you dive into any of the like separation of voices and the counterpoint and whatnot, it's nice to have this little opening, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, for me, although it's not, we just literally have the written out piece, don't we? And it's an Italian tablature, and there's no. Is there actually a title in the Siena book? There isn't, is there? I don't think it's actually named even. We've probably got the name from the you get so we've got the name from the Paris manuscript, which is slightly earlier, isn't it? So that's kind of like 1560. So it's an early piece. It could have been earlier than that, maybe. But I sort of feel that beginning is it just suits the title. I mean, the title Ricercare derives from the Italian cercare, to seek. So it is kind of like it's testing the range, isn't it?
When we're talking about a ricercare, quite often it's referred to like a precursor of like the fugal nature or later
Yeah,
on of counterpoint, right? But
yeah,
is it also kind of have like some prelude aspects to it as well? Like because it's a little bit looser usually and it's quite exploratory in
yeah.
I guess a gentler way than the Baroque you would usually do it, maybe.
I think that this piece is almost a sort of frozen example of improvisation. It's kind of like been set, freeze framed, as it were, and that opening is a sort of part of that oral tradition, plectrum lute, this sort of up and down linear style.
Right. Because when you look at like Da Milano's works, they are often quite a bit more strict and a little bit more similar to like the vocal works of the time period. They're like
Yeah,
it really starts off with a really clear motivic idea, and you usually get
yeah.
that right away in the second voice, and it's a little bit more strict. And this feels a little bit more free.
And this is where it sort of comes to the I don't know how you feel about it, but there's sort of a big debate, I think, between what is a ricercare and what is a fantasia. Because you mentioned de Milano's fantasias, and they're a lot more. They have that element of freedom, but there's also a cohesiveness to it. There's structural counterpoint. There's a little bit of imitation, not a huge amount. Um, but with this, I mean, one of the sort of things that I felt was there's kind of no rules, and you sort of have that freedom in the first 5 bars to just sort of really be elastic with the tempo there, and make it sound sort of improvisatory. You are searching. And it does sort of hark back to that oral tradition. I've read a little bit about this, and I don't know if you know about the style that was called contrapunto alla mente, which basically means counterpoint of the mind. And it's where this sort of idea, it's half improvised, it's half preconceived. And you usually do get this sort of, and again, it's very exploratory, sort of these simple chords with single notes in the middle. And then it doesn't quite end where you want it to end. It's sort of like still seeking.
Yeah, and even I found even within that too, like the intervals are in the if you take an individual voice at a time, they're quite similar. Like I was looking for like exact thematic, imitation.
Yeah,
But even like the first few notes there, they do share contours quite often, which is interesting. I wasn't, there's some clear imitation in the piece a little
yeah,
bit later on that's like
yeah,
exact, but then at the opening, it is kind of like very similar lines, like that opening bass line there has kind of a shape, and when that second voice enters, it kind of has a similar shape there,
yeah.
but it's not exact. So
No.
it that makes a lot of sense, and I like how it delivers in a gentle way like that.
Yeah, it's just full of surprises, I think, all the way through. This is one of my favourite bits. And yeah, just sort of constantly finding these lovely moments. How did you find playing it on a modern guitar in terms of right hand articulation? It must have been quite different for you.
I mean, I have like tons of questions in this regard because
Go for it.
there are differences. Well, there's differences between lute players and guitar players in many ways. Our instruments are a little bit different, and probably the pedagogy is like a little bit different as well. I
Yeah,
think like in general, classical guitarists have been trained a lot to play in a really, I mean this in the nicest way to all the guitar players, in a real boring way, like really even and without a ton of rhythmic, not the same amount of rhythmic, strong, weak,
yeah,
rhythmic sense that you get from a lute, which might have in part to do with like the plucky nature of the lute versus that so much sustain on the modern guitar
yeah,
almost gets to me sometimes when I'm playing this music. I would almost rather it be a little bit more plucky. And I also find that as soon as I turn it into a notation score, I can't help but just, and I hope I don't push it too much on the piece, but I can't help trying to play it like just super horizontally. And I wonder if I lose a little bit of the lute aspect of the piece when I do that.
Yeah.
Even listening to you just now, I'm like, yeah, like my performance just seems really smooth, as if I'm trying to play like a vocal in tabulation.
I'm sure it's very beautiful performance.
Well, thanks, but nevertheless, like when I hear the lute, I hear the voices
Yeah.
occurring and I hear the imitation, but I also get this plucky nature and this strong, weak rhythmic delivery
Yeah.
that is so filled with charm and interest. And sometimes when I listen back to my recording, I'm like, mine just seems like it lacks all those things. It might have other things, maybe,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it sometimes lacks that. And I guess that's part of my question to you is, what do you think the big differences is are in terms of performance when a guitar player plays something or a lute player?
I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there in terms of this idea of what I like to call sort of strong, weak beats. So I spent many hours, many years sort of honing the difference between the character that my thumb produces between the character that my index finger produces. Whereas I believe, I mean, it's such a long time since I've played guitar, I believe it's sort of, as you say, it's more kind of evened out for the modern guitar technique. Is that right?
Well, I think the plague of
Yeah.
the guitar exam
Yeah.
has made people practice technique, and you're supposed to play your scales in this even,
Yes. Yeah.
even arch, and people and guitarists have done that for hours and hours and hours,
Yeah.
but they
Yeah.
might have, it's possible they might have lost something as well. When you play that opening passage though, do you use like are you playing like finger thumb like?
So my thumb is always the downstroke. It's always the one that will sort of give you that sort of rhythmical articulation, and it when alternating it between the index fingers, it's like an upstroke. So if I were holding a quill, I'd be going down, up, down, up, down, up. So it's sort of like a remnant of the quill. I still go down with the thumb and up with the index finger. So the index finger has a different sound. So even if I just play, I've got that heaviness on the thumb and almost like a sort of upbeat with the index finger. And then of course my middle finger I use for different purposes as well, usually to sort of brighten a chord or if I need to brighten a note in between chords.
Whenever I listen to an early music specialist even play guitar, I often hear them, they have that same rhythmic feel. And I think guitar players have a very difficult time trying to reproduce that. Like on the recording that I did, I was kind of like purposely trying to train my, fingers to do something like
Sure.
that, but it
Yeah.
wasn't that successful. In the
Yeah.
in the end, I ended up playing it much more in, well, I guess in some ways it wouldn't be necessarily like an early music performance style.
Sure.
And guitar players have a hard time with that. So I wonder if it's something that guitar players need to actively work on with the technique they usually use, or if they should adopt some lute techniques sometimes.
Possibly. I mean, the other thing that we've got to remember is that your instrument has great sustain, whereas my instrument it just kind of dies away. And I've got gut strings, so they're really light. So I've got quite a lot to play with in terms of the energy that I put into the string. And don't forget that I don't use nails. I mean, I would be laughed out of the nail bar if I went into one. So I've got a really direct feel of that string on my finger. So with that feeling and then the energy that I need to put into the string, it's just really a very, very personal, direct tone that you get from that. Whereas with the nail, I mean, obviously you shape it, and everybody has different ways of shaping the nail. There is just that little bit of distance between you and that tone.
I think absolutely, and I think it's it's all, and it the way that we form like our musicality and our technique together have so much to do with that to some
Yeah,
extent. And that's, I do find it difficult to try to imitate the lute all the time. And I
yeah,
think that's why sometimes when I'm playing, like when I was playing this piece, I try to lean more into like a vocal composition. And then but then I start to worry that I'm losing some of the charm of the actual piece because I'm
yeah.
trying to make it into something it
I
maybe
don't.
actually isn't.
I don't think you should worry about that because I mean a lot of this repertoire, particularly the the fantasias and ricercatas too, they came from that improvised vocal tradition. So, um, I mean there are quite a few intabulations in of vocal repertoire in the Siena Lute book, but I wouldn't like to say if this is one of them. I can't imagine it is actually. But I think there is a direct reference to vocal music and that whole improvisatory tradition of it. So I'm quite into thinking about playing a piece in vocal terms because quite often I'm thinking about the soprano line or I'm thinking about the alto lines being pulled out of the texture or everything being supported by the bass line. It's really good to think orchestrally. Or vocally, as I was trying to say.
Which actually
With this
brings me to a
repertoire.
question about arranging this music into notation.
Yeah.
So in my score, I usually like pull out lots of hair during these
Oh.
transcriptions because I often like I don't even want to put it into notation sometimes because I feel
Yeah.
like I'm really having to make an awful lot of choices, and it's sometimes not what the music maybe is, and but I do have to do something. And so like in my score, if you've looked at it much, like
Yeah.
yeah, I use lots of ties,
Yeah.
which represents an awful lot of sustain and overlapping of intervals that I might not like consider compositionally like
Yeah.
completely appropriate all the time, but
Yeah.
it's definitely one way of writing it without a bunch of rests.
Yeah.
And especially in terms of like writing it out in literal notation versus interpretive notation.
Yeah.
And for guitar players that might not know what that is sometimes when lute music is written in notation, we will write it out just in one voice. Is that
Yeah.
like just sometimes?
Um.
And then interpretively, you'd play it as a multi-voice texture,
Yeah.
but sometimes that would be a literal transcription. An interpretive one would separate it into three voices
Yes.
sometimes, and
Yes. Yeah.
you'd see
Yeah.
it differently.
I think your score's great, and I think you've it's really difficult because as a lute player, obviously I do tend to just go to the tablature, but also I have I've got good continuo knowledge. So whenever I just look at a piece of tablature, I can sort of see it. I can see it in modern notation as well, but in doing so, you have to unpack the tablature, which is in fact what you've done. Is you kind of unpacked the tablature, and you've managed to put all those tied notes in. And I think a lot of it is, understanding that the note does go across the bar, allowing for a lower note to sort of pop through into the texture. I mean, in my scores, I don't know if listeners, it'd be quite fun for listeners to choose your score and then choose my score and then you can compare. Because mine is just the tablature. And what I've tried to do is I've tried to mark in the sustain where you've got ties. I've tried to, but if I did that to every single note, it'd just be a sea of just lines. Nobody be able to read the actual music.
I think it might get guitar players into trouble because the sustain of our instrument is
Yeah,
so much more that
yeah,
keeping our fingers down all the time might
yeah,
cause more
yeah,
troubles than on the
yeah.
lute, where the attack of
Just
each new note
goes.
is just going to be much more dominant.
Yeah,
But it does it. And in my video, I kind of do some highlighting of the notation to show different voices. But for me, at least, it turns it helps guitar players see the voicing if they don't have the frame of mind for the early music texture.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think
And so
that's
that's helpful, even if you don't necessarily want to sustain all of those notes quite as long as my
yeah,
notation score indicates,
yeah,
which yeah, that just becomes a kind of a choice, I guess. But I guess some other just like practical things about the piece. Maybe you could talk to the guitarists a touch about what kind of ornamentation they might use in this piece. I didn't really use any. I was really focused on just the voice playing, but usually this piece would be ornamented a little bit, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think ornamentation just was part and parcel of everything that you did, and it's part of that sort of quasi improvisatory style. I didn't use that much either, just because it's just so pretty. The only bit I did was at the beginning. I think I just did a little couple of flourishes. I think I was quite elastic with the beginning. I think so. I might have done that. It might not be exactly what I did in the performance, but and then I just sort of went into the sort of narrative of the musical language after that. Ornamentation is a funny thing, isn't it? It's so personal.
I suppose there weren't guides to it for a little while still, like period guides to it.
We have the Petrucci editions, so we've got the Spinacino and the Dalza, which is all done by typeset. I think part of the problem is they just didn't have the right, wood block for ornamentation. so that caused a few problems. Yeah, you get into the later sort of 1518, you start looking at English manuscripts. The best example is the Dowland Folger book, where there's lots and lots of ornamentation, handwritten. Again, we don't know the scribe. That gives us a really good insight into what they played, when, how. But it's not till a lot later. I mean, Thomas Mace's Music and Monument, which I think is 1676 now, talking quite a lot later. I hope I haven't got that date wrong, might have done. Where he actually starts to write down what the sign is for the ornament and what it actually means. But again, there's no consistency. There's no consistency in terms of, countries or even composers as to what the ornamentation means. I think it's just all down to taste and what you feel comfortable doing.
And of course, guitar players, because my followers are mainly guitar players, but they have to get out to lute concerts and listen and
Yes.
get a feel for the different time periods and geographic locations and what kind of sound early music specialists are
Sure.
making, because there's a
Yes.
whole world that you can just pick up through osmosis by going to concerts and seeing lute
Absolutely.
players, interacting with them,
Yeah. Yeah.
having guitar players play for lute players in master classes,
Yeah.
which you do regularly, right?
I do, yes, at the conservatoire. So I've got sort of a group who come and bring this kind of repertoire to me on their modern instruments, and we talk about primary sources and technique. What instrument would it have been played on? So for example, I'm playing on a sixth course. If I was playing a bit of Weiss, I'd have to pick up a D, a Baroque lute in D. But going back to ornamentation, it's really important to recognise that the lute repertoire, although it's huge, so you've got the really early stuff, even the stuff that's not written down, way up to Weiss, but you can't apply the same ornamentation that you've learnt in your Weiss piece to a piece like this. So you've got to be really careful about the context with which you are playing in. That's one of the reasons why whenever I pick up a piece, I always try and find out about the manuscript. When is it dated? What other composers are working around in that genre? What country, obviously? What instrument must I be thinking about using? That's all really important and all feeds into your playing.
And it can be a deep dive sometimes, because
Yeah.
especially I've been doing more of the Baroque guitar repertoire, and it gets complicated, like deciding
Yeah.
what tuning they used,
Yeah.
ornamentation, all those different questions. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
and again, um, getting out to the concerts and
Yeah.
seeing
Yeah.
people is going to be so important. And certainly, like, one thing I would like to start doing on the website, and maybe you can help me with it, but is teaching students to learn to read, French and Italian tablature,
Yes.
within confines of the easier,
Yeah,
works to approach,
yeah,
because it's very doable. Like I'm very comfortable reading French tablature, Italian tablature. When it's
yeah,
upside down like that, I still get confused and
yeah,
mess it up
yeah,
sometimes. I was going to say one of the great things about your scores though, because I did look at your score for this piece, and one thing I really liked about it is that the amount of information that I can get from it when I'm reading it, compared to like when I look at my edition. I'm obviously trying to like make almost like a facsimile or a comparison score or something like
yeah.
that. But your score is like, it's very informative. And I think when people are approaching this for the first time, your score is what they really need and what they will want.
Oh, that's very kind. I mean, it is supposed to sort of get you off the starting block because, I mean, like I said, like we were saying, in tablature, you have to unpack it. So it's okay for me because I'm sort of, as I say, when I see tablature, I can sort of almost see the modern notation. I could see where the line's going. But quite often, lute players only read from tablature and get a bit locked into it. Um, and can't always separate the lines, just understanding the language, whereas with your lovely score, it's very very clear where where the melody's heading. You've got separated parts, the bass line with the stems going down and the melody line with it going up. It's very very clear, and you just don't get that with tablature.
But of course, just starting with something easy like French tablature, you don't want to necessarily start with German tablature or anything like that.
No.
But yeah, and then there's this huge world like this piece,
Yeah.
and this piece, there's no known notation version that I don't think it exists in the whole
No.
world.
No. No, that's
And
true
it's just
actually.
sitting there.
Yeah, yeah. It's just there. It's
I
like,
looked everywhere. I mean,
yeah. Oh, I didn't look.
I
But
well,
I
I
hadn't thought
looked
of that.
everywhere because I was
Yeah.
desperate to see like, oh, maybe I could compare what I did to someone.
Yeah. I hadn't thought
uh,
of that.
because
Yeah.
I'm pretty confident, but I'm not always 100% confident
Yeah.
about what I'm doing all the
Yeah. Yeah.
time. I
Yeah.
usually need to consult
Yeah.
someone or something like that.
It's a bit like coming across a work of art that nobody's sort of found. It's just been lying around in a cupboard, isn't it? You could sort of bring it to life. Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
you get to paint
Yes.
on top of it a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's been absolute joy discussing all of these things and more. I mean, we could talk for hours, I think, on so many different things. But this has been really really wonderful, and
I really want to thank you because I think this video gives guitar players a little bit of insight as to how far, you can dive into this stuff, both in an easy way, but
yeah,
also in a very interesting and engaging way. You can engage with this music so much. Like if we can
yeah,
talk about it for hours, then
yeah,
then if you're playing the piece, you can engage with this music so much. And
yeah.
I think this video and talking with you gives some insight into how you can do that.
Oh, well, likewise, it gets under your skin, and then you get the bug, and then you turn to the dark side. You start cutting off all your nails.
I have because I have almost purchased lutes on numerous occasions,
Oh,
but the when I play them, my fingernails don't always sound as the way I imagined it.
yeah, yeah. Well, there's a lot of filing you can do. Yeah, yeah. There's sort of compromises you can make. Yeah. Anybody listening, go and check out Brad's video and his scores. They're absolutely fantastic, and his YouTube channel, stunning.
And check out Liz's YouTube channel and luteweb.com.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Brad. See you.
Thanks so much. Bye bye.
Do you know what I've done? I've been such an idiot. I've forgotten to press. I forgot to do the record. Oh, that was a real blooper. I pressed record on everything else, but not on the computer. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.